Okay, welcome. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all our participants joining from Europe. Good afternoon to all those joining from Japan. We are about to start our second public webinar on EU-Japan relations in a post-COVID world. We've been quite optimistic here at the Japan program. We have set up this event to look at some of the security challenges that have been exposed in the context of the COVID pandemic crisis that we are still unfortunately living. The first session has been a closed one, looking at the problem of disinformation and the battle of narratives that has unleashed in the context, or that has been accentuated in the context of this pandemic, and the present one looking at the resilience of global supply chains. Now, I must admit that I have been one of those blissfully ignorant people until pretty much the crisis. The supply chains, global supply chains, at least for security people, who have not been necessarily very involved or following the geoeconomic trends, have been something there lingering and distant and nothing to be really worried about. But of course, as we have seen from the health material, from the many discussions that started since over a year, we have seen the fragility and the risks that we are exposing ourselves on pretty much everyday basis. I'm most delighted to welcome four distinguished speakers who know about this topic much more than I do, which is not so complicated. And I'm really eager to listen to their views. The idea is to present a European vision and a Japanese vision, because security and resilience of supply chains has been one of the topics that has been identified by the governments of Japan and the European Union as a potential issue to cooperate on at the latest EU-Japan summit, but also in the previous summits. I mean, of course, the two economic partners have much to discuss, and this is one of those topics that have suddenly shifted on the top of the agenda. So our first speaker would be Professor Takashi Terada, a professor of international relations at the Japanese Doshisha University, who I understand will allow us to zoom a little bit on the global trends, on some of the main problems of supply chains and the current trade deals that we hear so much about, like RCEP and CPTPP, their impact on the resilience of supply chains. Then we will switch to Alicia Garcia Herrero, our senior fellow at Bruegel Institution, looking at the European position and vision of the problem, but also on the impact with the European relations on the European relations with China. Switching afterwards to Professor Yuka Fukunaga from Waseda University, and finally ending with our analyst from MERICS, François Chimitz, who has been looking at the Chinese receptiveness and perspective on the issue. We only have an hour and 15 minutes, so I'll cut it short here and switch straight to our speakers. Just please be reminded that this is a webinar session. Your microphones and cameras are off. If you want, and please do post questions, please do so at the Q&A dedicated box on the right bottom of your screens. This session, this whole panel will be recorded, and you will have the opportunity also to listen and re-listen and repost it anytime you want. So without further ado, Terada Sensei, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your kind introduction. Also, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this online conference. I think this is very topical and also important. So I'm also looking forward to learning something related to the European visions or perspectives on global value chain. Particularly, my focus is on trade institutions in the Pacific. And this is something which I think the organizer requested me to talk. So I'm not probably detailing the individual institutions and the rules, anything like that. But I try to depict some sort of the pictures of from which probably we can have some sort of better understanding about what will be going on and something like that. Can I share my slides now? Or, okay,
Absolutely.
right. Thank you. Okay. Wait. Okay, I have only 3 slides for my presentations. The first one is actually what cover seat. But this may be most important because the title just carries what I'd like to say most. But US-China hegemonic competition, economic norms, rules, and institutions. So I'm talking about some of the institutions in the Indo-Pacific region, which may have, of course, the huge impact on the European countries and also companies. And but also I'd like to say the the rules and norms are quite different in terms of the institutions, and what sort of the impact this sort of differences may have on the nations, trade policies and integration approaches, something like that. This is what I'd like to say today. Okay. Wow. Okay, this is sort of the mapping or illustration of the current Indo-Pacific trade institutions. Well, it looks quite complicated compared with Europe. Europe has only quite big one, and with a different, well, a lot of the functions and areas of the coverages. But it seems to me in the Indo-Pacific and different institutions have different functions, but most importantly, different memberships. And memberships, particularly a powerful member which try to exercise an influence in terms of the institutional impact on member states. So I think that's why the China, Japan, even some of the middle power countries like Korea and Australia in this region try to work quite hard to push their own agendas based upon their own chosen norms into and also try to work together with like-minded states to realize some of the institutions. So again, as Eva mentioned in the beginning today, we have 2 big trends of regional integration at the moment. One is RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with the 15 member states. Actually, India was there, the second largest populated country in the world. But India is now getting out of it, and partly related to the India's concerns about the RCEP promoting the China's export to the country. And also CPTPP, originally called TPP, but the United States under the Trump administration got out of it, just like here. And Japan, I just put the center here, worked so hard, probably we never saw such kind of the diplomatic activity that Japan had after the maybe Asian financial crisis in 1997 to realize abortive Asian Monetary Fund at that time. And now TPP, called CPTPP or TPP-11 were realized. So 2 big important regional trade and investment framework institutions now emerged. Well, RCEP may be probably, well, as some of the newspapers said, will be emerging this year, depending on the member countries' ratification processes. But nevertheless, and also couple of the implications this map may carry. Number one, China here now shows an interest in joining the TPP because TPP was expected to help the exercise and influence of China's behaviors because of the so-called high quality goods, like the restrictions on the activities on the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, even prohibitions of the forceful opening of the source code of the IT products. I think a lot of Japanese and also other member states companies and invested China have struggled with this kind of rule at the moment. So TPP was sort of the institution to spread the rules which China probably find it hard to accept to the region. So this is sort of their initial America's interest. But interestingly, China now said, we are now interested in joining the TPP. Even last week, the China National Congress, just Xi Jinping mentioned about TPP participation again. So that probably has if realized, quite huge geo-economic impact. And the United States, Biden administration, he's a vice president at Obama administration, which pushed the TPP very hard, but very quiet. And at the moment, still, finding the way to participate in TPP, but in the midterm election in 2 years' time makes it very difficult for Biden administration at the moment to say something positively on its participation, possible participation, or possible return to the TPP. But United Kingdom now expressed the interest officially, and Japan, as a country like Australia, welcomed it. So currently, Japan and the member states are so much interested in expanding the memberships so that the TPP could be more effective. Number two, the EU, because it's a EU-based conference, I just put the EU. EU is also very active in having and approaching bilaterally FTA with the Indo-Pacific countries are just illustrated with lines. But of course, the remaining question is whether EU may have a more FTAs with mega FTAs like RCEP or CPTPP. That would be probably something we need to consider. And also United States also quite keenly looking at as a sort of the possible future trend. So in the Pacific, I know it's a bit remote from the Europe and the United States, but it's now the center or gravity attention of the trend of the trade and the investment in terms of the institutional integration as well. And this is, okay, my last slide. It's slide just described my own thoughts on the current, the sort of structural element. And that could be probably impacting the most of the nations in the globe, particularly trade and economic policies. Again, I put a lot of letters, so it looks also quite complicated. But again, message is the China-US as a loggerhead situations on economic rule makings. And now the both nations have tried to quote key countries to realize their own positions on trade and investment. But China is, of course, approaching Japan and approaching the European Union. Just, we saw the last minute agreement on the China-EU comprehensive investment agreement, CI here. I know it's quite controversial and some actually criticize it, and particularly EU may make concessions and for China. The US and of course, coming to Japan, I know not TPP, but US-Japan, particularly trade agreement and free and open Indo-Pacific. This is more related to investment, infrastructure investment, which may be probably not relevant to today's topic. But I think the EU-Japan, this is probably one of the more focuses of this conference today. We have EPA and SPA, and also Japan is now quite keen to help the European Union coming to this region, particularly in terms of the investment, connectivity in European terms, or infrastructure investment, which was already signed by both sides. So I think usually we are looking at US, China, Japan, and Indo-Pacific, but EU is now coming to this region as a key player. So we have 4 polars in this region, particularly they try to work together or separately to exercise the influence. So last minutes, United States, Biden administration's still we are waiting for the trade policy announcement, but anyway, worker-centered environment, labor focuses in its trade policy could be probably identified. but worker-centered, environment conscious, and also labor, which also means human rights protections, are all actually incorporated into CPTPP. And the three major principles of the e-commerce or digital trade are also incorporated in TPP, as well as, of course, Japan, UK FTA, which was just effective a few months ago. So I think that's something which China is also quite, in some concerned about it. And because, China's economic policies in terms of the SOEs, also protection of the maybe steering the AI technology, something like that, could be probably hampered by this rules, expansion in this region through the institutions. So I think the Japan EU needs to work together in this, as this slide illustrates, particularly to realize their own positions, while in China, US have continued, the struggle for the its own power maximization approaches in trade and investment. I think time has come, so I should finish. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Terada Sensei. I wanted to say, well, thank God that you only had 3 slides, because these were very dense, information-dense slides. They were really, really interesting. I hope you can share it with us later. Thank you for keeping the time as well. I will pass the floor directly to Alicia Garcia Herrero. Of course, Alicia, if you want to also react on some of the points raised by Professor Terada, you're more than welcome. But we're looking forward to hearing your European perspective on the issue.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to share these views with this very interesting panel. I do think talking about the world, Japan and Europe, and looking at it from a perspective that might be more similar than we had ever thought, is in itself a great achievement of this seminar. And what I mean to say here is that, I mean, for a long time, maybe we would imagine that Japan and Europe were very far in terms of, how we do things, etc., how we see the world. But because of US-China strategic competition, we're closer than ever. And I think that is a very important point I want to highlight. Let me tell you where we may be closer and where we may be somehow still far away, and what to do about it. So first of all, before we even talk about US-China strategic competition, I have to say that we've done our homework. We have a free trade agreement, very hard, as you can imagine. We're not necessarily very complementary as economies generally, because we are specialized in similar sectors. Think about the auto industry. We compete in third markets, and therefore, this has been a great achievement. And that's already the beginning of a nice story. But now we are confronted with an increasingly tense competition between the US and China. And the question really here is whether we're taking the same road or we're taking a different road. It's very hard to answer that question, but I think that's really what I want to discuss here, perhaps during the Q&A. So first of all, of course, and this is just the way it should be because of geographical closeness, Japan has done more, at least on its centrality, to achieve regional trade deals. And this is obviously CPTPP. And I have to say that Japan was very bold to take this baton from the US after Trump ditched the baton somewhere, and you found it and got it out, and it is impressive. And now, interestingly, we Europeans, we have a number of deals. We have a deal with trade deal with Japan, with South Korea, with Singapore, with Vietnam. And of course, we could discuss about our investment deal with China. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we do not have a regional deal. So the question is, what should we do? Should we get even closer by thinking supply chain, or perhaps even parallel supply chain with CPTPP, or should we think it differently? Should we use, just the existing trade deals we have and think beyond trade? Think about standards. Think about us, by the way, Biden is making us all, bringing us all to think security issues in supply chain, and I'm of course referring to the executive order that is still pending announcement. So in that regard, I think it's very interesting to see where is Japan going to sit. Of course, we're all aware of your efforts to reshore part of the most critical part of your supply chain on of course, and this is COVID related, some medical products. But the question is that going to be expanded? Is that something that the US intention, which is very much more into the highest end semiconductors, electric vehicles, something that Japan is going to pursue? What will Europe do? I think that's where I think common thinking would be very helpful beyond our trade agreement. So are we heading closer or not on this idea of supply chain resilience? Are we following the US, or are we going to have our own strategy? Is it going to be CPTPP related? Is then Europe out? All of these questions, I think they're very, very important. The other issue, of course, beyond trade and supply chain disruptions, comes into the most obvious things in which we would have to cooperate. But the question is, I'm not seeing it so clearly yet. Again, are we going to get closer or not? And this is, of course, in the rollout of vaccines and vaccine distribution beyond borders. And also, beyond COVAX or with COVAX. But the question is, any joint effort we could think about? And the other one would be, of course, climate change. So these are the things where, we might have to think beyond our trade agreement. The final thing comes to security. And here I have basically, of course, NATO and what might be next for NATO, and then Quad and the Indo-Pacific Alliance. And I think the question is, what's the link? Is there any link? Are these two boats that are diverging, or are these two boats that are converging? Of course, here, I think the answer so far seems to be maybe there is some convergence. We're seeing increasing efforts, especially both France and Germany on that front. But the question is this something that Japan and Europe can push? And I think this would be basically my thinking for this session. So I have more questions than answers, but I think it is really about time to think beyond our trade deal. And every question I brought to the table, whether it's standards, whether it's supply chain resilience, whether it's vaccines, climate change, and security, I guess there's two ways to think of it. One would be to use the CPTPP platform and go beyond, but I think that's very hard to bring Europe along. It's just too big to kind of jump on such a boat, because in a way, I wouldn't say it can sink it, but it's just very hard to accept all of that already readily made deal for Europe. And the question is whether we could think of an alliance of that deal with, kind of bringing all of the CPTPP and Europe together. And of course, UK would be an important question, given that it has already applied officially. So can that go beyond what we have now, which is basically a trade deal? And I would finish with a word on the investment deal with China, whether this can kind of push our divergence in all of the topics I mentioned. That's the final thing I want to mention. And I actually think the answer is no. The reason is that deal, which to me was somewhat rushed, I've said this many times, is a very tiny deal. It might not be tiny in terms of bringing China to beyond its commitments on the WTO, i.e. in terms of international, of its international impact. It actually opens the ground to a better treatment of SOEs at the WTO, maybe not perfect yet. It covers subsidies on services, which the WTO doesn't. It does offer some help for the international community, but that is not necessarily something that will radically change bilateral relations between China, economic relations between China and the EU. On that front, whatever is like direct market access, not much has changed. And for that reason, let alone the reactions, some of which pretty pessimistic on where this is heading, let alone Biden's position, which we didn't know when the deal was signed, which is much more, I would say, belligerent. Maybe belligerent is too strong, but let's use Biden's own word, extreme competition-like approach. I think it's going to be very hard for Europe to make a big thing out of that deal. And therefore, we will see more and more autonomous measures. We're already hearing more about autonomous measures than the deal itself. And thus, I don't think the EU-China investment deal is enough, important enough reason to create divergence between Japan and Europe for the reasons I have mentioned. For the topics I have mentioned. And that is all from my side. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Galicia. Well, thank you for bringing in the KAI. We know that that's been one issue of contention also, or criticism with our Japanese colleagues or with our transatlantic colleagues. And it was obviously something that we were about to discuss. And thanks for pointing out that we should not stop there. There's much more that unites us in that respect. Fukunaga Sensei, est-ce que I'm switching to French automatically? Can I pass you the floor now to ask something about the Japanese perspective, not necessarily on the KAI, but I imagine also ending with some of the perspective for EU-Japan cooperation, but still sticking to supply chains. Thank you.
Bien sûr. So I also share my slide. Wait. I basically have only one slide. So the topic I was given is what Japan can do to enhance cooperation with the EU and build more resilient global value chains. And as a trade law policy expert, I have been in this field for quite some time, but sometimes it's very difficult to picture how trade agreements actually work. But this pandemic sort of made us realize how global supply chains are connected with each other. So in that sense, as Eva mentioned, I'm also learning from this process how trade agreements actually affect the real world, or how global value chains work together, and so on. So, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted significantly global value chains. And well, I think it's almost inevitable that unexpected events such as a pandemic have a serious impact on global value chains. But I think the impact could have been minimized if we were well prepared to handle these situations. But there are two factors, I think, which exacerbated this negative impact caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of them is the over-reliance on China. Japan is very much dependent on China for the supply of many essential products such as PPE and rare earths. I myself regularly buy masks from China. Today, I wore a Chinese mask, so on. So we, not just Japan, but many countries are really reliant on China for the supply of many goods. And the other element I want to mention is the lack of political cooperation. Well, it is almost shocking to me that many countries scrambled to secure the supply of essential goods for their own people and hardly cooperated with each other. So that brings me to today's question. I think in order to build more resilient global value chains, we need diversification and reshoring, as well as international cooperation. And in terms of diversification and reshoring, the Japanese government has already taken some measures. One of the objectives of the economic stimulus packages that the Japanese government has adopted is to help companies to diversify their production bases and reshore some production facilities. But Japan is a resource poor country and also a high cost country. So Japan cannot build resilient global value chains on its own. And international cooperation is essential. So this is my question, especially as Professor Terada has described, Japan has many international agreements with many countries, and those agreements should be used to reinforce global value chains. And Alicia also described many channels, and I think no channels should be excluded. Japan should take advantage of every single way to reinforce the global value chains, but I'll focus on the possible cooperation between Japan and the EU. And I have 5 specific policy proposals. One is to make sector-specific, product-specific arrangements. Well, Japan and the EU have signed the Economic Partnership Agreement and the Strategic Partnership Agreement. These agreements are very important, but they provide only a basis to further enhance the economic ties of the two sides. We have to make sure that these agreements are implemented and bring about real economic benefits. And I think for that purpose, sector-specific, product-specific arrangements will be useful. As Terada Sensei has mentioned, Japan has signed comprehensive economic agreements with many countries. And now it's time to sort of materialize what is envisioned in these comprehensive economic agreements. And I think by signing sector-specific, product-specific arrangements, Japan can do that. For example, Japan and the EU can sign a sector-specific agreement on climate change, or Japan and the EU can have a new arrangement on digital trade. And of course, Japan and the EU can have a sector-specific agreement on the issue of health, which is very urgent right now. So this is my first proposal. And the second proposal is also concerned about Japan-EU bilateral relationship. And I have to say the second proposal may be a bit controversial, which is to agree on rules and dispute settlement to protect and facilitate investment. Well, Japan and the EU have signed the EPA and the SPA, but there is a critical missing link in these agreements, especially in the EPA, which is rules on investment protection and investment dispute settlement. Now, the EU has agreed in principle with China on a comprehensive agreement on investment. But Japan and the EU, the friends, do not have comprehensive rules on investment protection and investment dispute settlement. I think this is very unfortunate. And investment is a critical component of global value chains. And I think it's essential for the two sides to agree on rules and dispute settlement on investment. And on this matter, I know that there is a huge difference between Japan and the EU. The Japanese government and the Japanese industry strongly support the idea of investment arbitration, while the EU is very skeptical of it. And the EU is now trying to create a new dispute settlement system for investment disputes. But I think I think I have to say my view may not, or my view is not really shared by the Japanese government and the Japanese industry, but I believe that the Japanese industry may overestimate the value of investment arbitration, and the Japanese government might underestimate the costs of investment arbitration. And I'm hoping that Japan will reconsider its approach to investment agreements and get closer to EU's approach on this matter. And the third option is to negotiate, to encourage EU's involvement in the Indo-Pacific region. I think this is not controversial and everyone can agree on this matter. And I think Terada Sensei has mentioned the concept of FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific region. And the EU's involvement in this region is really can connect the EU to the Asia-Pacific region. And for Japan, the core of Japan's global value chains exist in the Indo-Pacific region. And the Japanese government has taken extensive measures to strengthen its global value chains in this region. So the EU's involvement in this region will be very beneficial for Japan. And the fourth one is negotiate rules on disciplines on industrial subsidies. Well, this is concerned about the trilateral initiative among Japan, the EU, and the US. In January 2020, those three trading partners agreed on some guidelines on new disciplines on industrial subsidies. And at that time, the major concern was that China extensively provides support to its domestic industry, and that distorts trade environment. But I have to say the environment has been changed dramatically since then, because now in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries started to provide extensive support to their domestic industries. And some of the support may be trade distortive, but they also have positive impact. So it's getting more difficult to distinguish actionable subsidies, trade distortive subsidies from justified subsidies. And I think that the three, Japan, US, and the EU, should work together to develop new disciplines on industrial subsidies. And finally, if I have time, Japan and the EU should cooperate on WTO reform. And there are many issues regarding WTO reform, including dispute settlement, of course, digital trade, and health and trade, and so on. But I think I want to highlight the importance of transparency in the monitoring. Well, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries took export restrictions on certain essential products, and those measures provoke serious concern. But WTO agreement basically allows such urge emergency actions to secure the supply of essential goods. And we cannot limit members' right to take such measures. But it's important to make sure that those measures are not abused. So to prevent the abusive or discriminatory use of exceptions, which allow export restrictions, we need to reinforce the transparency and monitoring function of the WTO. So this is my intervention, and thank you very much for your kind attention, and looking forward to your question. Thank you.
Fukunaga-sensei, thank you so much for this. We often look up to Japan actually as the sort of example in diversification or building more resilient supply chains, not just for this May announcement already. Japan was the first country that actually proposed a financial compensation to its companies from being less reliant on the Chinese production, but also before COVID actually. Japan is of course dependent on rare earth materials from China. And I remember already every time there's a crisis in 2010, in 2012, Japan has been the first to be exposed actually to this problem. So we have a lot to learn. And thank you so much for pointing out the recommendations. I mean, here at the Japan program, we're even more pleased that Japan is eager to see a greater involvement of Europe in the Indo-Pacific. That's what we're striving for. That's our political game. Goal, but also for pointing out the WTO reforms. I understood that was actually one of the points that was discussed in May last year also at the EU-Japan summit. And I think that builds one of the concrete steps that we can, means one of the concrete steps that we can build on. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to your points in the Q&A, but before that, our last speaker is François. We've been kind of going around China the whole time. And obviously it seems that the world and our two main protagonists here realize that decreasing our reliance or excessive reliance on China in those supply chain is the ultimate goal, whether it's through reshoring or diversification or building up our own reserves, whichever method there is. How does China react to it? Is it something that would be ultimately beneficial to us? I mean, can it not return against us at some point? Or how does China view this trend? We know that there's a special term for it in China. Of course, China is not, apparently there's a special term. I read it somewhere. But we imagine that, of course, it may be a concern. And how does this all turn out, basically, for China?
Yes, so I'm going to quickly brush through what indeed has been the kind of the elephant in the room throughout the discussion when you talk about supply, which is basically China. So most of the participants have already mentioned through a couple of times, but now I'm going to just try to look first at why China is being such an important topic when we discuss about supply chain resilience. Well, the first thing is China is the largest trade actor in today's globalization and has unique characteristics that really probably have sparked a specific concern regarding supply chain resilience. But to start from a Chinese point of view, I think it's important to bear in mind that contrary to most countries, China has a strong history of awareness or obsession, depending on how you see it, of economic dependency towards foreign countries. And actually, when you go through the history of China, you can almost see all the major economic policies through a lens of reducing or monitoring economic dependency, be it the Great Leap Forward under Mao, or the going out policy under Jiang Zemin to actually get out and obtain and secure commodity access, or even the China 2025 that we saw in 2015, or even the Belt and Road Initiative that can also be seen through a lens of securing supply for China. So this is something that actually is more familiar to the discussion and the vision that has developed in China of what international economic interaction are. And more recently, the shock that has occurred in China because of the restriction on technology export from the US, first as a threat on ZTE, and then as a progressive tightening of Huawei, has definitely contributed to raise this awareness further. And you have seen many speeches over the past 2 years, especially by Xi Jinping himself, which basically in China really sets the trend, emphasizing the need to move towards more technological independency, hence securing somehow the supply chain of technology. And this is definitely something that is now set in the next 5-year and 15-year, 25-year plan, sorry, 15-year plan, or has come, and I think that was what you referred to, Eva, previously, under the vocal of dual circulation. So the tendency has been here for a long time. It has been even stronger recently, also pushed by external factors from the US. And beside that, on a more, let's say, offensive front, and I think that's why everyone mentions China so much. China has a history of weaponizing economic interaction, and I think on that front, maybe the best example is the specific awareness of the topic that most of Chinese Asian economic partners had much earlier than let's say European partners, or a bit less so than American partners, and that is because they have been confronted with this growing powerful China that has not been reluctant to use economic interdependencies in a geostrategic manner. Best example, or the first most iconic example, was indeed the rare earth export restriction in 2010 towards Japan, but you have through times again and again examples such as the TAD spat on missiles in Korea, where basically China restricted not only supply but also exports. Also imports through restriction of Chinese tourists moving to Korea. So just that's a side note, but just here we are focused on supply. But I think on a purely economic point of view, looking at the offer side is also a very important, as important almost as the other, especially in Europe, when you have a Germany that is so highly dependent on Chinese demand. It is something we are definitely experiencing, but that's not the topic here today. So besides, sorry, tiny computer issue. So, So you have China, which is such a unique partner that has this culture and this habits of leveraging economic interactions to actually create geopolitical moves or benefits. And in the meantime, you have China that has basically become a key node in the international trade globalization. This is probably one of the most iconic graphs to sum up the emergence of China as a key node. I won't go again through the fact that China is the largest world importer, largest world exporter, and blah, 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 has the first trade partner for, I think, something like 60 or 70% of the world countries. But actually, what's something that is a bit overlooked often, it's the fact that China has indeed become a key node. It has been slowly climbing up the value chain, but that has been actually quite rather slow. The fact is, most of the size of China is basically due to its population size. You have roughly 20% of the world population in China. So the sheer development of a basic industrial capacity oriented towards export mostly creates a gigantic trade partner. But when you look at the success in China to climb up the value chain, which is here to be looked at, actually, which is can be seen in the blue line going down, because as you usually go close, further away from upstreamness, you actually move towards more complex and more technical products, has actually been rather if not slow, at least not supersonic, as you might have a sense in the public discussion often when China is discussed. And when you look at the actual leverage that China has through its economic interdependencies, well, you have a sense that once again there is a raising awareness, but that has created kind of an overhyped or excessive fear of what the reality of dependencies are. Here, I'm gonna be a bit. I'm going to show some work from my institution, which is MERICS, when basically you look at the reliance of EU consumption on Chinese products. Well, apart from mobile phone, it has been rather limited, and that is kind of confirmed by a study that was conducted by the French Treasury and published in late December last year, where basically they looked with an IMF methodology at what is the real vulnerabilities in terms of where is China a main actor and where there is no diversification options available. And looking through those kind of double criteria, they only find 12 lines of products where actually there is a high dependency on China for France with limited diversification possibility. And they went through almost every European, major European economies to find similar type of strong dependencies. So actually you do have some strong dependencies, but have been very, very much localized. And you also have a more qualitative study from Rhodium that was published, I think, in September last year, that basically asked people, do you think that this sector is at risk of economic or let's say geostrategic leveraging in case of tension? And basically what they found was that 83% of the EU imports from China were rather green, what they call the green list, which is a list where basically there has little perspective for geostrategic leverage. So the point here is not to say that there is not a dependency issue, but it's to say that this dependency issue, especially in Europe, have long been overlooked and is now kind of being overhyped a little bit. And I think it's important to rationalize the discussion as much as possible in order not to get into some kind of crazy paranoid or overreaction. And actually, it's also important when you look at China to realize that China itself has a very strong dependency on the outside. First one being agriculture. You know that China has a ratio of the world population that is much higher than the ratio of the productive land as a share of the world productive land, and it imports a lot of especially protein for meats, and a lot of meats, which is essential for first well-being, but also the basic development of human being. So you do have a strong dependency on agriculture, despite the fact that it has been a strong emphasis of independency for now more than decades. Similarly, on technology, and especially I think semiconductor may be the more iconic example here. A recent study, I think that was by ICS Insight in a couple of weeks ago, found out that only 9% of the semiconductors sold in China were actually Chinese made or from Chinese firm, which is far off the objective of having something like 50% by 2020 in the China 2025 industrial plan. And in looking, for instance, at Europe more specifically, with the same MERIC study that was published a couple of in November last year, well, you actually find quite a decent dependency of China on imports from the EU. So once again, I think it's important to try to have an exhaustive and balanced view of what the reality of the issue is. The problem is, I think here, that China has been somehow short-sightedly eroding the very system it has benefited so much from. And that kind of recipe for distrust that China has created really bites into the very foundation of an international open economy or economic order. And when it comes to China, this can be summed up as a strong opacity, which is both a side effect and also a deliberate choice by the Chinese Communist Party that has been functioning as a very opaque 90 million people structure, able to conduct its own internal policy without much people knowing it. Its recent turn towards a wolf warrior type of communication internationally has also definitely strongly harmed the trust as China as a partner, not only by the way the communication, but also sometimes some of the actions through economic coercion. And I think this is something many countries have been familiar with, but the recent example of Australia, for instance, or the words of Wang Yi when he's during his visit through Europe, when he basically threatened Czech Republic of strong retaliation because of one politician going to Taiwan, definitely shocked people a lot. Added on the top of that, some poorly done disinformation campaign throughout the COVID pandemic that really shocked a lot of people, thinking here of Italy or even France, plus this general aggressive tone of techno-nationalism that you can find throughout the CCP structure, and even at the very top at Xi Jinping. If you look at a recent publication by Xiu Shi in November of one of his speeches that he gave last year, where he basically said that China had to leverage its gigantic market to attract economic actors from outside in order to prevent those economic partners to react to Chinese coercion, was really something that does not help in creating trust, and that has trickled down in having today. And that's not the only reason. I mean, there's also a global resent towards globalization and so on that China has been kind of the culprit, the easy scapegoat of. But that has also definitely contributed to today having public opinion views on China throughout at least Europe and the US, as I know for sure, but pretty confident that it's similar in other countries, that it's basically at historical low. And that, besides the current politician in place, definitely sets the tones for a long-term, much more difficult cooperation with China in general. And especially with the COVID, that has translated more recently in general reviews of dependencies, which are not officially targeted at China, but which everyone knows who the main target is. You've had that in Europe, you've had that in the US. You've already had actions in Japan and Korea to try to diversify away from China. You have strong push in public opinions or low tones actions in Europe. France has, for instance, a relocalization program as part of its recovery plan from COVID. So those actions are slowly building up. And as a reaction, and I think it's almost rational to have that reaction on the Chinese side, you've seen a stronger push for China to try to secure partners through deals, be it RCEP, CAI, or the strong intention that they've publicized to try to join the CPTPP. And an even more technological independence push to basically secure its domestic production or its supply in case of an extremely adverse or tense situation. And that leads me to my final question, and I think it's trying to cut short here a little bit, is whether those rational reaction by China, aren't they already the signal that we are on a downward spiral toward a suboptimal, uncooperative equilibrium in terms of international economic order? And I think that's a more subjective opinion and where I might have a bias, but I think that the strong narrative displayed by the Biden administration of a coalition of democracies, of liberal countries working together, could definitely be a big challenge for China, especially on supply, where you have all those, at the moment, non-coordinated initiatives, but that do share very strong similarity in terms of worries and target, China, and that could actually be bundled up in a more general coalition to have, let's say, a liberal free supply chain. And I think that's what some of my colleagues here have mentioned. Just very last note, and just a reaction, just to maybe start a conversation to what Mr. Fukunaga just said about Europe being reluctant towards investment arbitration. As she rightly pointed out, I think it's, at least at the political level, maybe not in public opinions, but it's more a question of trying to push a new type of investment arbitration that departs or corrects what is perceived in Europe as the flaws of the usual ISDS system. So not a reject in general, but rather a push for a new type of arbitration. And thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Francois. This was extremely helpful. It really helped to put everything into well, to kind of put the big picture into the question. I found it very educative. You mentioned at the end that perhaps this coalition of democracies working together and realizing the common threats or the things that actually bond them together is maybe one thing that could put a pressure on China. I believe that is already happening. It's already happening with the sort of dialogues that we're having. It's already happening at the political level as well. One of such initiatives has been the Japan, Australia, India initiative for resilient supply chains. The other more political ones would be at the Quad level, whether the Quad at some point would eventually adventure to some of these more geoeconomic battlefields is actually one of the questions, I believe. But it's quite it's a very timely or good angle to look at it, because it brings us to the first set of questions that we have received from our participant. Specifically, one of them was on the supply chain resilience initiative with Japan, India, and Australia that Japan launched, I believe, last year. It's from Céline Pajon, addressed to our two Japanese speakers in priority, but of course, all of you are more than welcome to comment on it. I would just expand this question, perhaps, what is behind this initiative? And if that is something, these sort of formations are something worth joining. You imply, Francois, that it's the case, because the more the more impact. So I would presume that's already a harbinger of such an answer. The second question from Céline is more specifically to our Japanese speakers as well. How do you assess a year after the first measures that have been applied to China, as I already mentioned in May last year? How do you assess the success of those measures? Did it lead to a decline in Japanese FDI in China, or restructuring of these foreign direct investments? That's from Céline. Another question from Natalia Martin. How do you see a potential for EU-Japan ASEAN, as I presume, trade deal, and its impact on the resilience or diversification of those global supply chains, addressed to all the actors? So I would probably turn first to our Japanese speakers, because it's more starting with them, but then expand to all of you. What do you think of those coalitions of democracies? Can you elaborate a little bit more on the supply chain resilience initiative? What is your assessment, kind of looking back a year after, behind you, of the first Japanese measures imposed on China in May last year, and finally a potential for an EU-Japan ASEAN deal? Terada Sensei, would you want to start with the questions?
Okay, thank you very much. First on the coalition of willings in terms of the democracy, particularly India and Australia and Japan on the supply chains. I think it sounds interesting, but the different country has a different, of course, the weakness in a sense. Australia's investment in the region is much smaller, and also India's interest in investment is more Western world, like African countries. And Japan certainly has a huge investment in China and some of the ASEAN member countries. So I think the area of which three nations have investment is quite large. Certainly it could be covered by Indo-Pacific region, that's true, including in Africa. So how we can actually find some sort of quite effective way for three countries with different investment interest to realize. I think that's more political in a sense. If China pushed hard from Australia, for example, as Francois mentioned, also I recently wrote the article on China-Australia issues. Well, certainly in Australia could be probably more reliant on Japan. As you can remember, soon after the Suga administration, after the Abe Prime Minister Morrison came into Japan, I know that it's very difficult time for Prime Minister in Australia because he needs to, attention for 2 weeks and anything like that. On the ASEAN, the third question, ASEAN, EU, Japan trade deal, I think there are many obstacles in a sense. Sorry, I'm talking about a more pessimistic one, but it's more on EU side. If EU try to separate political, human rights, labor issues from trade deals, that could be probably possible ways. But if Myanmar is a part of ASEAN, so ASEAN probably cannot be happy with the sort of the separation approach. Okay, 5 nations ASEAN, okay, EU has FTA or something like that, no others. Or if Myanmar excluded, I think ASEAN wouldn't come. I think ASEAN's solidarity should be respected. And also in this case, the EU and the European, particularly United States as well, find it very difficult to take any sort of the economic positive agreement with ASEAN member Myanmar. So I think how do you deal with these political problems again, in terms of having an economic agreement with ASEAN? What is the second one? Japan's approach to the diversify the Japanese investment in China. As far as I read, the applications are quite limited, and even the applications includes the investment decided by Japanese companies before this announcement. So it's quite messy, but there was a few concrete examples. The shifting the Chinese and territories to Osaka, Kansai areas by some petrochemical companies, as far as I heard. So it had some impact, but still we cannot see visible, concrete, or positive, or upfront, the upsides of the application, something like that. But in this case, as someone already mentioned, using the integration framework CPTPP would be probably more effective in terms of trade diversion. I think that could be something which Abe administration considered as a useful way for Japanese companies to consider about the diversification of the investment and the trade with China. I should stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terase-sensei. I understood that it was also very limited in scope. It was limited to medical material only, so that's why the implications perhaps are not so broad. Fukunaga-sensei, would you like to continue on this? And of course, if you have I'm realizing we won't have probably time for a last round of questions. So if you have any reactions to some of the presentations that we heard from your colleagues, please, you're welcome to say your final words as well.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief and I'll try to respond to the questions, very interesting questions about the future Japan-EU relationship. And let me address first the possibility of Japan-EU-ASEAN FTA. And do I think it's feasible? I think it is. Maybe I'm a little more optimistic than Terada-sensei, but I think it is feasible. I think the conclusion of the RCEP shows the flexibility that ASEAN countries have in concluding FTAs, and that flexibility can be used to enable such kind of arrangement among Japan, the EU, and ASEAN. And I think it's also desirable in a sense, given the economic close relationship among these countries. But do I think we should try to conclude on the Japan, EU, ASEAN FTA? I'm a bit skeptical. And personally, I think comprehensive economic agreements are becoming a little bit obsolete. It takes time to negotiate and conclude comprehensive economic agreements, and it takes time to get them ratified by the domestic parliaments. And those agreements make trade more complicated by complex rules of origin and so on. And that's why I proposed earlier in my presentation that perhaps we should seek more lighter, narrower, sector-specific, product-specific arrangements instead of comprehensive agreements. And Celine's question, I think it's premature to assess how successful Japan has been in diversifying production and supply chains and reshoring them. But I want to highlight that Japan was successful in diversifying its supply chains of rare earths. I forgot who mentioned this, but Japan had a crisis in 2010, 2012 with China, and China restricted exports of rare earths. And Japan learned from that experience, and Japan has reduced its dependence on China for the supply of rare earths. And I see a very high interest among Japanese industries in further diversifying supply chains. Perhaps they transfer their production sites to other ASEAN countries instead of China. And those projects are already ongoing. And about the Quad, well, the Quad politically is very important, and it's a core of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. But in terms of supply chain, I want to emphasize, for Japan, Australia is critically important. And there are some projects going on rare earths or hydrogen to enhance cooperation with Australia and perhaps with the United States. And about the possible future participation of the EU, as someone has mentioned, Japan and the EU have share the economic structures. We compete rather than cooperate to get essential products. Now, well, I have to say we are now competing for vaccine, but anyway, so it may be difficult for Japan and the EU to cooperate in the supply chain of those essential goods. So we have to have other countries engage in our relationship. Perhaps Japan can cooperate with the EU in the context of the Indo-Pacific region, as I said. Japan can cooperate with the EU and Australia. Those kind of trilateral framework will be effective, I think, for Japan, both Japan and the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's really a lot of points that are worth noting down, and frankly, I think the product-specific agreements are a very interesting one, and avoid some of the issues that your colleague earlier mentioned about Myanmar, human rights, etc. Excellent. We'll now move to our two European panelists with Alicia first. Alicia, would you like to add a few words at the end or answer one of the questions?
Sure. I think I want to follow up on basically what has been mentioned on the likelihood of a mega FTA between ASEAN plus Japan and Europe. And I quite agree that not only is it difficult, perhaps it's not about difficult, it's just too slow. I don't think it can really happen at the speed we need it to happen. On the other hand, though, I'm not sure the sectoral arrangements will solve all of our problems, meaning I can think of that maybe for the semiconductor industry. Europe is trying very hard to become more independent in this sector, and we are stepping up our efforts in the era of strategic independence, or strategic maybe independence is too strong nowadays, but the point is that sectoral arrangements will not solve the key issue here, which is what are we going to do? And I think I forgot to mention that point is extremely important with the WTO, meaning we're still thinking the WTO will be there, thus we can focus on sectoral arrangements. But if I generally use the word the Titanic. If the Titanic really sinks, then we can't cope only with sectoral arrangements, and we're kind of in the cold. So I guess the time we can gain with that strategy is only possible if the WTO stays afloat, and that's a big question. I've been researching on China's demands for reform, and frankly, I think we're so far apart that I just can't imagine. So it's not about the US anymore. It's about how far apart we are in what we consider to be a reasonable reform between the EU, US, and China, and probably also Japan, since I've also been reading about what Japan would like that reform to be. So I guess if that doesn't happen, what are we going to do, Japan and Europe, in that reality? I think we're one of the biggest losers, beyond, of course, smaller emerging economies or in the Singapores of the world, or but we're big losers. So I think we need to think like a plan B. Maybe it doesn't have to be a big deal, but we might have to go beyond, and that was the point of my presentation, what we've already agreed upon in our FTA. We may need to go beyond the topics and think very carefully whether we can have a close or a non-divergent, at least, position in this EU-China strategic competition. Because if Europe and Japan manage to do that, I think it's a stronghold for the rest of the world. They can anchor their kind of quote unquote neutrality, or separate or different position in this stronghold. So that's why I think perhaps the best option is to expand that agreement beyond trade and investment, and I think that would be perhaps quicker than that big option of FTA with ASEAN plus. But more, how would I say, but bigger in scope, more strategic than the sectoral agreements. I'm not saying they are supplementary, but I do think that the former is even more urgent and more important, especially if the WTO Titanic really, doesn't come out of that turbulent times that it is in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. You're absolutely right. I think that's precise, or going beyond the FTA is precisely the point behind the EU-Japan SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, that is there as a framework, but of course needs to be fine-tuned. But one of the key elements, of course, of it is also looking for a common strategic positioning on China that would kind of fit the trade deal into perspective. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Francois, your final word, and the final word of this meeting is yours.
Oh, just to quickly come back on one point that was made, that's really a kind of a punctual remark, is don't overestimate the ability of Europe to deliver on FTAs. And shouldn't, as a European, and I'm not sure I'm really helping my community here, but the Mercosur will be one example, but especially me being French, I'm quite aware of that. The level of resentment in France toward globalization and trade is really at a point where there is doubts on the ability of Europe to sign anything comprehensive. When it only goes through the Commission and the member states, you might have a chance. As soon as it starts to hit the European member states, public discussion and political process of validation, you definitely have a big issue here that you should never overlook, I think, to my opinion. The one thing that has been a little bit also not directly mentioned here is, probably that was also my part in the discussion, is the reaction of China. And what is something that really worries me a lot is the inability of China to rationally react to partners' action, and basically you can find that in the total lack of self-reflection of what's their own responsibility in the growing trends of tensions. And even in the academic field, when you look at academic discussion in China, it's really hard to find people that raise the possibility of China having a form of responsibility in the US actions. It's basically absent, and that also translate in the public discussion, I mean in the authoritative political discussion, when basically every action is taken as a total irrational action of hate towards China, whereas most of the time, I'm not saying that is totally absent, I'm saying there is also other factors at play that are systematically overlooked. And that is really worrying on the ability of China to just have a conversation and find compromise with partners. And my last point, and that relates a little bit to the one I made about Europe, it's also something that's just a question that I share, that I personally have, and it is a strong one, is the ability of Europe to actually bear the real costs of confronting China on, be it economic values or even human rights values, but that's another topic here, but just economic values. At the moment, Europe has talked a lot, saying open economic strategy, having a geopolitical commission, and blah, blah, blah. It has beefed up its ability to respond, but it has not actually responded yet. It has not actually bear the cost of Chinese retaliation. And considering the fragmentation, political fragmentation of Europe, I have some serious doubts on the ability of Europe to withstand Chinese pressure. And I think one iconic example of the ability of Europe to probably sometime skip the difficult either thinking or situation, it's basically the fact that at the moment, they are still asking the US to start a WTO reform by alleviating their veto on the appellate body of the dispute settlement of the WTO without proposing any alternative leverage for an effective conversation. So basically, once again, the Europe is betting on kind of a really, if I were really harsh, I would say rosy world of happy cooperation, where basically China is, and others are benefiting from statu quos that they have no leverage to change if they do not block the appellate body. And once again, the European Commission in its new trade policy review has renewed the fact that to them, US had to start the conversation by making the appellate body function again. But then what's the leverage? And that was asked by Chad Bown to Miss Vayant in an interview in December. And she basically said cooperation and peer pressure. That is, when you know China a bit, you can have serious doubts on the ability of such pressure to make things move, especially when there is high cost. And so it's not of a very positive tone. So I'm sorry for that, but I think it's really something that people should give a strong thought on, especially Europeans.
Definitely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think you said it well. Words of caution are definitely welcome and much needed. We need to keep our feet on the ground. We need to also realize that talking with an potentially irrational actor is difficult when we're trying to put forward rational solutions. And we see that also in other areas. But unfortunately now we have already crossed our time limit, as perhaps expected, we should learn the lesson and dedicate a little bit more time to those questions. Well, thank you so much to our 4 excellent speakers. It's been a delight to have you. Thank you really for your input. I hope we will stay in touch. Many thanks to all those who have put this meeting together, notably Natalia and Celine and Jess. Stay tuned for more interesting topics of the Japan program. You can follow us on YouTube. You will find this video recording of this session and of other events on our YouTube channel on Japan program BUB, and you can follow us on Twitter. With that, I say goodbye. Stay safe, stay COVID-free, stay well, and I hope to see you in another occasion. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.